Throwaway account. I'm 31M. She's 29F. We weren't married, but we'd been together long enough that people assumed we were headed there. 3 years. Shared routines. Shared friends. Shared future talk that always seemed just close enough to touch. I thought we were solid, just busy. She started saying things like, "This year is just hectic," or "Once things calm down, we'll have more time." I believed her because it felt reasonable. Careers get intense. Life speeds up. Love adapts. That's what I told myself. The first sign I ignored was how plans shifted. Dates became tentative. Weekend depended on how tired she was. If something better came up, friends, work events, spontaneous invitations, I was flexible. Proud of it, even. I didn't want to be the guy who needed to be prioritized every time. That was the twist. I thought being understanding made me secure. I didn't notice how often I was being rescheduled instead of chosen. How often I waited to see if I still fit into her calendar after everything else had been placed. One night, she canceled dinner last minute, saying she forgot she'd promised a friend she'd help them with something. She sounded apologetic, but not conflicted, like the decision was obvious. I said it was fine. I meant it. At least, I thought I did. Later, sitting alone with food I'd already ordered, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not jealousy. Replacement, like I was still important, but optional. I didn't know it yet, but that feeling was the beginning of a pattern, one where I wasn't being left. I was being kept, just not first. And once you realize you're a backup plan, every maybe starts sounding different. After that night, I told myself not to read into it. Everyone cancels sometimes. Life overlaps. Being in a relationship doesn't mean you stop having other priorities. I repeated those lines to myself like rules I was proud to follow. The twist was how quickly flexibility stopped being a choice. She began assuming I'd be free, not because she checked, but because I always was. Plans were suggested, not confirmed. Maybe we can hang out Friday? Turn into, I'll let you know. And I waited, always waited, because pushing for clarity felt needy, and I didn't want to be that guy. I noticed how she'd message me late in the evening once everything else had settled. Not to make plans, just to check in. A meme. Miss you. Enough to keep me close. Not enough to take up time. I responded quickly every time. I wanted to show I was still here. One weekend, I blocked off time for us. Turned down other invitations. She texted the morning of to say she was exhausted and might just stay in. I told her to rest. 2 hours later, I saw a photo of her out with friends. She hadn't lied. She had stayed in until something better came along. That was the moment it clicked. I wasn't being taken for granted accidentally. My availability had become a safety net, something she could rely on when nothing else demanded her attention. I was the constant, not the priority. And the hardest part was realizing how much I contributed to that role. By always saying yes. By never asking where I stood. By calling uncertainty patience. That night, I didn't confront her. I didn't withdraw either. I just sat with new understanding. Being flexible doesn't make you valued. It makes you convenient. And convenience is a dangerous place to build a future. Once that thought settled in, convenient, I couldn't shake it. I started noticing how often my life was paused, half open, waiting for her to decide. Friday nights with no plans because I was keeping it open. Sunday afternoons spent checking my phone instead of actually doing anything. I wasn't choosing her anymore. I was orbiting her. That was a twist. I realized how much of my time existed in a holding pattern. I'd tell friends maybe. Avoid committing to anything too fun, too far, too final, just in case she became available. And when she did, it was usually last minute. I'm free now. Like a pop-up window, I was expected to click immediately. One night made it impossible to ignore. I'd turned down a birthday dinner to stay free for her. She'd said we'd probably hang out. At 9:30 p.m., she texted, "Can't tonight. Long day. Rain check?" I stared at the message longer than I should have. I wasn't angry. I felt stupid. Not because she canceled, but because I'd rearranged my life around a probability. I ordered takeout again, sat on the couch again, and felt the quiet weight of realizing I'd been living on standby. That's when it hit me. I wasn't prioritizing the relationship. I was deprioritizing myself. Slowly, politely, voluntarily. I thought about how rarely she waited for me, how rarely she adjusted her plans around my availability. The imbalance wasn't loud, it was routine. And routines are dangerous because they feel normal until you step outside them. That night, I decided I wouldn't confront her yet, but I would stop waiting. Because love that requires you to keep your life on pause isn't commitment. It's containment. The change wasn't dramatic. I didn't announce anything. I just stopped bending my plans around the possibility of her. When a friend invited me out on Friday, I said yes without checking my phone first. I didn't warn her. I didn't ask if she might be free later. I just lived my life. That was a twist. She texted that evening, casual as always. "What are you up to?" I told her I was out with friends. There was a pause, longer than usual, before she replied, "Oh, okay, have fun." It wasn't jealousy I sensed. It was surprise. For the first time, I wasn't immediately available. I wasn't waiting in the wings. And I realized how rare that had become. The night felt lighter than it should have. Not because I was trying to make a point, but because I wasn't managing anticipation anymore. Over the next week, I kept doing it. Making plans. Keeping them. Letting my time belong to me first. When she suggested something vague, "Maybe we can hang out later," I responded honestly, "I already have plans." No apology. No explanation. She started reaching out more, checking in earlier, asking instead of assuming. And that's when it really hit me. My availability had been doing a lot of quiet work for her. When it disappeared, the dynamic shifted immediately. One night, she joked, "You're busy lately." I smiled and said, "Yeah, it's been nice." The word surprised both of us. I wasn't trying to punish her. I was just reclaiming something I'd handed over without realizing it. My time, my energy, my sense of choice. And once you stop treating yourself like the backup option, people start to notice. The question was whether she'd notice enough to choose me, or whether she'd just missed the convenience. Her behavior changed fast, faster than I expected. She started suggesting plans days in advance. Real plans, times, places, follow through. She asked what I was doing instead of assuming I was free. On the surface, it looked like progress, like she'd realized something and adjusted. That was the twist. Instead of feeling relieved, I felt cautious, because her effort didn't come with reflection. There was no acknowledgement of how things had been before. No, "I'm sorry I kept you waiting," or "I didn't realize how much I was taking your flexibility for granted." It was like she'd flipped a switch without naming why. One night, she asked if I wanted to grab dinner on Friday. I said I could, and she smiled, really smiled. Later, while we were eating, she reached for my hand and said, "I like you like this." Busy, confident. The comment was meant as a compliment. It landed strangely. I realized she was responding to my availability changing, not to my feelings. She liked that I wasn't always there, not because it made the relationship healthier, but because it made me more interesting, scarcer, less guaranteed. That thought sat with me longer than I wanted. I started noticing that when I did make time for her, it was suddenly valued more, praised, even, and that's when the discomfort sharpened. I didn't want to be chosen because I'd become harder to access. I wanted to be chosen because I mattered. The effort was real, but it felt conditional. That's when I asked myself a question I hadn't before. If I go back to being fully available, does this disappear again? And more importantly, do I want to spend my life managing someone's interest in me by staying just out of reach? For the first time, her choosing me wasn't enough. I needed to know why she was choosing me now, and whether that reason would last once I stopped holding my life at arm's length. I decided I couldn't keep guessing. Not about her effort, not about her intentions, not about whether this version of us was real or just reactive. So one evening, when things felt calm, not tense, not rushed, I brought it up. I told her I'd noticed a change, that I appreciated the effort, Then I asked a question that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. What made you start trying now? She blinked like she hadn't expected that. Then she laughed lightly and said, What do you mean? I've always tried. The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed, like it was meant to end the conversation. That was a twist. I explained, carefully, how often I'd been waiting before, how often plans depended on whether something better came up, how small it had made me feel. I wasn't accusing her. I was just telling the truth. She listened, arms crossed, then said, I didn't know you felt that way. You never said anything. There it was, the familiar deflection. Not denial, just displacement. The problem wasn't what happened. It was that I hadn't complained loudly enough. I realized then that we'd never actually talked about priorities, about choosing each other intentionally instead of incidentally. We talked about feeling sure, but not about time, not about effort, not about what it means to show up consistently. When I asked her if she saw me as a priority now, she hesitated before saying, Of course. I just don't like feeling pressured. That sentence stayed with me because wanting to be chosen didn't feel like pressure to me. It felt like the bare minimum. And the fact that we'd gone 3 years without ever naming that difference made me wonder how many other conversations we'd been avoiding, mistaking comfort for alignment. After that conversation, the word pressure kept echoing in my head. I replayed it at random moments, at work, in the car, lying in bed. I tried to understand it from her side. Maybe she associated expectations with control. Maybe she needed freedom to feel close. I was willing to consider all of that. But the more I thought about it, the clearer something became. I wasn't asking her to give up anything. I wasn't asking her to choose only me. I was asking her not to treat me like the last option on the list. That was the twist. She could prioritize work without guilt, friends without explanation, herself without apology. But the moment I wanted consistency, it was framed as pressure, as if wanting to matter required justification. Over the next few weeks, I watched how she reacted when I didn't bend, when I said no to last-minute plans, when I rearranged my schedule. She stayed engaged, but there was an edge to it now, a subtle irritation, like my boundaries had introduced friction she didn't know how to smooth over. One night, she said, I miss when things felt easier between us. I almost laughed again, not because it was funny, but because I finally understood what easy meant. It meant I waited. I adapted. I stayed available without being chosen. I asked her what easy looked like to her now. She shrugged and said, not having to think so much about it. That answer told me more than she realized. Because love that only works when no one has to think about you isn't love that's choosing you. It's love that's fitting you in. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee the difference between being wanted and being convenient. That's when I started wondering whether the version of me she liked most was the one who asked for the least, and whether that was a role I was willing to keep playing. I didn't think of it as competition at first. There was no other person to point to, no obvious rival. What I was up against was possibility, the idea that something else might come along that felt more exciting, more spontaneous, more worth choosing in the moment. That was the twist. I realized she wasn't choosing between me and someone else. She was choosing between me and keeping her options open. And as long as I was flexible, patient, and available, I fit neatly into that arrangement. I didn't require a decision. I didn't force a choice. One night made it painfully clear. She suggested we hang out. If nothing else comes up, she said it casually, like it was an innocent phrase. I heard it differently. I heard exactly where I stood in that sentence. I told her I'd pass and made plans with friends instead. She looked surprised and a little hurt. I didn't mean it like that, she said. I believed her. That was the problem. She didn't mean it like that, because to her, that ranking felt normal. Later, lying in bed, I realized how exhausting it was to exist in a relationship where you're always provisional, where your value rises and falls based on availability instead of intention, where being chosen is something you wait for instead of something you can count on. I wasn't jealous. I wasn't angry. I was tired of auditioning without ever agreeing to the audition in the first place. That's when it hit me. I didn't want to be someone she chose when nothing better was happening. I wanted to be someone she chose because she wanted to build something, consistently, deliberately, without keeping one foot out the door. And once you understand that difference, you stop negotiating for scraps of certainty. You start asking whether this relationship is actually moving forward or just hovering in place while your life waits. After that night, I paid closer attention, not to what she did, but to why she did it. She still made plans sometimes. She still showed up. On paper, nothing was obviously wrong, but something had shifted in me. I wasn't measuring effort anymore. I was looking for intention. That was a twist. Her effort appeared when things felt unstable. When I pulled back, when I stopped waiting, it didn't appear as a steady choice. It appeared as a response, like a hand reaching out only when it sensed distance, not when it felt certainty. One evening, she said, "I feel like we're better when you're doing your own thing." She meant it as praise, independence, confidence, attraction. But all I heard was confirmation. My presence was most appealing when it wasn't guaranteed. I realized then that I'd been confusing interest with investment. Interest flares. Investment commits. Interest reacts to scarcity. Investment exists even when things are calm. And what we had was a cycle where my absence created interest, but my availability diluted it. That's not partnership. That's leverage. I thought about what the future would look like if this continued. Me constantly balancing closeness with distance. Staying just busy enough to be wanted. Never fully resting into being chosen. The image felt exhausting. I didn't want to become someone who had to manage their partner's desire by withholding themselves. I did want love to feel like a strategy. I wanted it to feel like a decision. That night, I stopped wondering whether she cared. I started wondering whether she was capable of choosing in a way that didn't depend on losing something first. And once you start asking that question, the relationship changes shape, whether you want to or not. Because you can't unknow the difference between being pursued and being kept around until something better doesn't happen. I knew I couldn't keep circling the same realization without saying it out loud, not accusing, not bargaining, just naming what was happening. So one evening, after she suggested we hang out, if our schedules lined up, I stopped her and asked a simple question. "Do you see me as a priority or as an option?" The room went quiet. That was a twist. She didn't answer right away. She smiled awkwardly, like the question was heavier than she expected. Then she said, "I don't really think in those terms." It sounded thoughtful, neutral, but it avoided the point entirely. I told her I needed to think in those terms, because my time and energy were being spent as if I was always available, always flexible, always waiting. She said she cared about me. She said she loved what we had. She said she didn't want to feel boxed in. Every sentence circled the same center without touching it. I asked again, more gently, "If nothing else changed, if I stopped pulling back, would you still choose me the same way?" She hesitated. Again, that hesitation was the answer. She finally said she didn't like feeling like she had to choose. That things should feel natural. Easy. I nodded, because I finally understood. To her, choosing meant closing doors. To me, choosing meant opening one and walking through it together. We weren't disagreeing about schedules or effort. We were disagreeing about commitment. And once that was clear, I stopped trying to convince her that wanting to be chosen wasn't pressure. I realized I was asking for something she didn't want to give, not because she couldn't, but because it would cost her possibility. That night, I didn't feel rejected. I felt informed. Because when someone won't choose you unless they're forced to, the most honest thing you can do is stop standing in the doorway, hoping they'll decide. After that conversation, I expected to feel devastated, or angry, or desperate to fix things. Instead, what settled in was a strange calm. Not relief exactly, but clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop arguing with reality. That was a twist. I didn't wake up wondering what I could do differently anymore. I didn't replay our conversations looking for better phrasing or mischances. The question had been asked. The answer, hesitation, had been given. Nothing else needed translating. Over the next few days, I noticed how different things felt inside me. When she texted, I didn't rush to reply, not to make a point. I just didn't feel that old urgency. When she suggested vague plans, I didn't wait around to see if they'd materialize. I made my own. The waiting had lost its grip on me. She sensed it. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was. Honestly, I wasn't pulling away to provoke a reaction. I was stepping back because I finally saw where I stood, and standing there didn't feel good anymore. The calm came from no longer needing to be chosen, to feel steady. I'd spent so long hoping she'd eventually decide that I hadn't noticed how much power that hope had over me. Letting go of it felt like setting something heavy down. One night, she said she missed me. I believed her, but I also noticed she didn't say she wanted to choose me. There was still a gap between affection and intention, and now that I saw it clearly, I couldn't pretend it didn't matter. That's when I understood something important. Sometimes peace doesn't come from being picked. It comes from no longer auditioning. And once you stop auditioning, the next steps stop feeling dramatic. They start feeling inevitable. The calm didn't go unnoticed. A few days after that conversation, she started acting differently. More attentive, more curious. Not dramatically, but enough that it stood out. She asked about my plans instead of assuming them. She suggested doing something specific instead of leaving things open-ended. That was a twist. For the first time in a long while, the effort wasn't reactive to distance. It was proactive, and instead of feeling relieved, I felt unsettled because something about it felt late. Not wrong, just out of sync with where I already was. One evening, she asked if everything was okay between us. I told her yes, because technically it was. We weren't fighting. We weren't tense. But I could tell she was asking a deeper question, whether I was still waiting. I realized then how much of our dynamic had depended on my hope, on my availability, on my quiet willingness to stay in the maybe. The moment that hope loosened its grip, she felt the shift immediately. She said she felt like she was losing me. I didn't argue. I didn't reassure her either. I just said, I think I stopped putting my life on hold. The words surprised me with how true they felt. She went quiet after that. And in that quiet, I understood something important. Sometimes people don't realize your value until they feel the absence of your waiting. But by then, the waiting has already cost you too much. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was just no longer standing by for a decision that wasn't coming. And once you reach that place, the end doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives with certainty. A few nights later, she asked if we could talk. Not casually, not in passing. The kind of talk that comes with a long breath beforehand. We sat across from each other, and for the first time in weeks, she looked nervous. That was a twist. She said she'd been thinking a lot, that she hadn't realized how close she'd come to losing me, that she didn't want to see other people, that she wanted to choose us. The word choose finally appeared, clear, direct, unmistakable. And instead of feeling relief, I felt still. She reached for my hand and said she was ready now, ready to prioritize, ready to plan, ready to stop keeping things open-ended. Everything I wanted to hear, just deliver at a moment when it no longer landed the same way. I realized something quietly devastating. Her decision didn't come from certainty. It came from fear of absence, from sensing that the safety net was being pulled away. And I couldn't unsee that difference. I asked her what had changed. She said, I didn't think I had to decide before. The honesty was unintentional and complete. I nodded, because it explained everything. For 3 years, I'd been an option she liked having. The moment I stopped waiting, the option became a loss. And that triggered the choice. I didn't accuse her. I didn't argue. I just said the truth. I needed to be chosen before I had to let go of myself to stay. She cried. I felt sad. But underneath it all, I felt steady. Because being chosen out of fear isn't the same as being chosen freely. And I finally understood that I didn't want a commitment that only existed once I was halfway out the door. Sometimes the hardest part isn't walking away. It's realizing the moment you needed came and passed, without you even noticing. After that conversation, there was a strange limbo. We didn't break up immediately. We also didn't move forward. It was like we were both standing still, looking at the same moment from different sides. She acted chosen now, present, attentive, intentional, and I could tell she meant it. That was the hardest part. If she'd been careless or dismissive, leaving would have been simple. But she wasn't. She was trying, calling first, making plans early, asking about my week in ways she never had before. On paper, it looked like everything had finally aligned. Inside, something stayed quiet. I realized her choice came with a condition I couldn't ignore. It required me to forget what it cost to get here, to pretend the waiting hadn't reshaped me, to act like I hadn't already learned how to live without expecting her to choose me. One night, she asked if I was happy now. I took too long to answer, not because I didn't care, but because I was finally being honest with myself. I told her I was calmer, but not lighter, that something in me had already crossed a line I couldn't step back over. She asked if there was anything she could do to fix it. I believed she wanted there to be. But the truth was uncomfortable. This wasn't about effort anymore. It was about timing. I didn't want to be chosen because I was almost gone. I wanted to be chosen when staying was easy, not urgent. And once I'd learned the difference, I couldn't unlearn it. That's when I understood something final. Sometimes a person chooses you sincerely, just not at the moment when it can still become the relationship you needed. And that doesn't make either of you wrong. It just makes the ending inevitable. The last conversation didn't feel like a breakup scene from a movie. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no list of grievances read aloud. It was quieter than that, almost gentle. And in some ways, that made it harder. I told her I believed she meant what she was saying now, that I didn't think she was lying or manipulating me. I told her I wasn't leaving because she didn't choose me, but because of when she chose me. The words felt heavy, but they were honest. That was the final twist. She asked if I was sure. I said yes, not because I was angry, but because I finally trusted myself. I explained that I didn't want a relationship where commitment only arrived once I'd emotionally detached enough to survive without it. I didn't want to wonder, years from now, whether I'd stayed simply because leaving felt inconvenient. She cried. I held her. That part surprised both of us. It wasn't about going back. It was about acknowledging that something real had existed, even if it hadn't been enough. Packing my things felt surreal, not devastating, just definitive. The first night alone, I noticed something simple. My time belonged to me again. I made plans without checking my phone. I went to sleep without waiting for a message. The quiet didn't feel empty. It felt clean. Here's what I learned. Being someone's backup plan doesn't always look cruel. Sometimes it looks like comfort, like freedom, like we'll see. But love that keeps you optional slowly teaches you to shrink your life around it. If you're reading this and you're always waiting to be chosen, waiting for clarity, waiting for timing to be right, ask yourself this. Are you being chosen or just being kept close until something better doesn't happen? Walking away wasn't dramatic. It was the first time I chose myself without needing permission.